Actually, that song is actually a good introduction for the whole section, for this whole series, I guess, for the Beatitudes. As we continue to look at the Beatitudes, Matthew chapter 5, verse 5 is our start for today's. So Matthew 5:5, "Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth." So it is the third beatitude in his introduction of this sermon that he gives that spans for 3 chapters, and the idea of being meek. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And kind of an interesting thought going through all of this, in that, we know that in the end the earth will be destroyed in the second coming, and we will have a new heaven and earth. But yet, even in that, we'll see possibly some of that at the very end. But blessed are the meek. Now, unfortunately today, when we think about the idea of being meek, the world sees it as, I can run you over and take advantage of you. Oh, you're weak. They forget that the W needs to be turned upside down so that it shows meek. It is not the same thing as being weak or easily imposed on, just totally submissive, or having a lack of spirit or character. It in itself is its own character. Jesus did not say blessed are those who are easily run over. He said blessed are the meek. We see that, we also see that he himself was not easily run over. Now, he may have let some things slide. He may not have, retaliated like the world thinks of retaliation, but that is part of being meek, not weak. The meek describes those who are able to control themselves and respond appropriately to the situation at hand. We are not a hothead. We are not just, I don't care. We're somewhere in the middle if you start to look at it, if you were to think about it on a slide. But so the first idea is, what is meek? So defining meek, and it took some time to figure out how to define this without the worldly influence of today saying that it is weak, found a definition that is mild of temper, patient under injuries, and long-suffering. And when we think about a meekness, if we think about having the ability to control ourselves and say the right things at the right times, stand up at the right times, and sometimes stay sitting down. Sometimes that includes us biting our lips. Sometimes it's sitting on our hands. Maybe we start jiggling our foot so that we don't have an outburst and we remain meek. Because in practice, it's having the power and knowledge, it's having power and knowledge of when to use it and how to control it. Something Gene would say quite frequently is, you may have the power to perform, but do you have the authority to act? And there's a very true saying, is that we all have the power to do things, but is it the right thing to do, and is it something we should do? We all have the power to be evil individuals. We can wander around the stores and just grab things and stuff them in our pocket and steal from people. We can lie outright to each other. Every one of us has the power to do it. Do we have the authority to? Do we have we can just randomly walk up to someone and slap them on the back of the head? But should we? Having meekness is the understanding of that power and knowing what we are to do with what we have. So the idea that the meek will focus attention and affections on the Lord and not on ourselves or our enemies. How many times is our enemy given too much power over us because we give them that power? How many times do we let someone get the best of us? But the question really is, did they get the best of us, or did we allow them to get the best of us? So understanding how we do this is possibly the idea for today, is looking at ways that we can be meek. And there's a wide range of those, because the idea here is mild of temper, Doesn't say absent of temper, but mild of, patient, and long-suffering. So which characteristics do we use at what times, I believe, is very key in our idea. So there are several people that I've highlighted throughout the scripture that we'll take a look at and what they did and how they were still meek in doing so. Before we get there, looking at James chapter 1, verse 21 here, says, "Wherefore lay aside all filthiness and superfluity of naughtiness, and receive with meekness the engrafted word, which is able to save your soul." So why is it that Christ says that we must be meek? Blessed are the meek. Well, James rephrases it or says it another way, is to get rid of the junk in our lives and receive the word with meekness. I have never seen the word of God be described as weak or unimportant or rolled over. So I think for him to use the word meek, we need to look at the real meaning of the word and not what some people have changed it to today. So below are a few examples of some of the people in the Bible who have been associated with meek. Abraham himself, if we go back and look at this in Genesis, he was very meek in his behavior and attitude. He was submissive towards God, but in such a way that it also gave him strength. When he left his country with some of his own kinfolk, he went wandering, and eventually he became a very wealthy man. And that's at the point where we look at right here of one of his characteristics of being meek. He and his brother Lot had a dispute with their herdsmen. Their herds and flocks and groups had become so large that they were still walking together, but yet they kind of needed to separate. They were taking up so much resource that they were almost competing for the resources they were at. And so Abraham, being the one who is walking with God, being probably having the authority over it, could he have just told his brother what to do? Quite possibly, quite likely. But instead, he takes in Genesis 13, verses 7 through 9, he uses what power he has in a meek manner. It says in verse 7, beginning, "And there was a strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's cattle, the herdsmen of Lot's cattle, and the Canaanite and the Perizzite dwell then in the land. And Abraham said unto Lot, Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me." How do we do this? He says, "If you will take the left hand, I will go to the right. Or if you go to the right, then I will go left." There was a conflict brewing between two brothers and the servants they had with them tending the herds. And they needed to space out. So he doesn't say, "Just get away from me." He doesn't say, "You go over there," because one land appeared to be better than the other. He said, "Which direction will you go? I will go the other. Let there not be any strife between us." So we see Abraham. He is called the father of the faithful. He is given great prize in Hebrews chapter 11 as being a man of faith. He walked with God. He was given promises. But yet he also had meekness. He had long suffering and patience to understand when to use boldness and when to have that brotherly kindness. We could also look at and go forward and look at Moses himself. He was actually described in the scriptures as a man being very meek. In Numbers chapter 12 and verse 3, it says, "Now the man Moses was very meek above all the men which were upon the face of the earth." And Moses, we know, went before Pharaoh with courage and strength of spirit to deliver God's message to let his people go. So he was determined to be very meek amongst all the men, but he also brought a very powerful message against a very powerful ruler. Going through and looking at, I've highlighted out as an example of the Exodus of chapter 7 through 11, because it takes a span of time to look at what Moses did. He went through looking at all these things. He went through taking and going to Pharaoh and putting forth the rod with God to do these different miracles, do these different plagues. We also see that Moses went on and did so much more as they exited out of Egypt. But with all of this, he was described as a very meek individual. King David himself, we see this in him as we look at part of his life. We look at that he shows reserve from killing Saul in the cave. We'll talk more about David again this afternoon, but just knowing looking at the history of David as he grew and as he was prominent when he killed Goliath, brought him much fame and jealousy from Saul, because people looked at David instead of him. So, of course, before this part here, Saul was the king and David was being chased by some of them. David found him in the cave and could have killed him, but would not kill the standing king, even though the king was trying to kill him. So David also showed his desire to not use deadly force against his own son as well. Later on, when after David is king and his son tries to overthrow the kingdom and take out his own father, he did not want his son to be harmed and would rather it be him. Long-suffering. The ability to know when to use a sword and when not to. David received his meekness not by using power inappropriately and kept it under control. Whereas Saul used his power through arrogance and might, almost allowing his own son to die. And look at that interesting spot there in 1 Samuel where there's a little discord back and forth, and he's like, okay, yeah, he can die. That's not very meek. Or the idea of chasing after David because there are some people that like him because he had the faith in God to take and deliver them from Goliath. And of how prominent he had become. How do we use what authority we do have? We can also take a look at Christ himself. Christ himself shows us several methods of being meek, and he does this a couple of different ways. Now, this one here, we see a couple of items. First, he starts talking through by telling us, blessed are the meek. Now, he gets this from Psalms chapter 37. And I'd encourage to look over and really dig into chapter 37 on your own time, because it gets to be a very interesting study if we look at the comparisons that he makes. He gets this out of, if we go to verse 11 out of Psalm 37, we see, but the meek shall inherit the earth and shall delight themselves in the abundance of peace. Continuing on, it says, the wicked plot against the just and gnash among him with his teeth. The Lord shall laugh at him, for he seeks the day is coming. It continues to, so Psalm 37 contrasts the meek, those who are looking towards God, versus those who are wicked and trying to do evil. It makes it an interesting study to look at it and see how some of these marks and contrasts are made. Jesus also says in Matthew chapter 11, verse 29, take my yoke upon you, learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart. Ye shall find rest unto your souls. Now when he says this, does this mean, lowly in heart, like he barely has one, that it's not present, that it's weak? Not at all. He's talking about being meek and lowly in heart, because if we look, and as we've started looking, the Beatitudes so far is blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are they that mourn. Now, blessed are the meek. If we look at the characteristic traits that we've looked at over the last couple of weeks, we see what this kind of entails. It's not just that I'm weak. It's not that I'm inadequate. It's that I myself don't think I am better than God. I am willing to lower myself and give to God. Christ himself has shown his meekness by leaving heaven to come to earth, to live an earthly life. That in itself is showing how he can be meek and lowly in heart. He is the Son of Man. He helped create all things, and yet in his meekness he became flesh for us, so that we might find rest unto our souls. He is looking out for each other. Much as Abraham was looking out for the relationship between him and his brother and the herdsmen and all the herd, let there be no strife among us. Christ is looking out for us. We can also go forward and look in John chapter 2 as we start to look at this next example that Jesus gives us. Christ uses power and authority to express the lack of respect for God. He had great respect for God, and he, to the point that he would let us know about it. He took, and in this passage here, starting in verse 13, and the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and found in the temple those that sold ox and sheep and doves, and the exchangers of money sitting. And when he had made a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple. And the sheep and the ox and the poured out of the changers' money, and overthrew the tables, and said unto them that sold doves, Take these doves hence, and make not my Father's house a house of merchandise. And his disciples remembered that it was written, The zeal of thine house has eaten me up. Christ used his power in this situation here. Can you imagine sitting with him there, walking around, and he's been talking about all of these things, about the kingdom is coming, and then you sit down and watch him build a whip and go after all of this that's going on inside the temple? Kind of an interesting thought that people like to say, what would Jesus do? Well, building a whip and going after people is not out of the realm of possible. Under the right situation. He still had his meekness about him, but he knew when it was time to stand up. This was a time to stand for what is right. Will we stand for what is right? Will we let our voice be heard at the appropriate times? There are times to sit down and just let we are also told not to argue with the foolish, for we will both become fools. But yet at times it is time to let the voice stand up. He used his power and authority to express that. It doesn't say that he caused any harm to any person, but he said, it is time for my Father's house to be back about its own business. It is not a place of greed. It is not a place for all of this. If you need to come to Jerusalem to offer a sacrifice, don't try and come in here to the money changers and to all this profiteering. Do it outside, and then come in with the appropriateness for it. But we also see an example where he is not quite as expressive in his manner here. If we go forward to John chapter 18, starting in verse 19, we see how Christ stood by his teaching and the way he called out those who were ridiculing him. In John chapter 18, verse 19, begins, the high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort, and in secret I have said nothing. Why ask me? Ask them which heard me. What I have said unto them, behold, they know what I said. If you're going to ask me about somebody else, why don't you just ask them? They're trying to focus on Christ. So when he said this, in verse 22, and when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? Can you just imagine that scene right there? Someone standing near Jesus. Jesus says, why are you asking me about all this? I have spoken openly, publicly, in the synagogues. I've said nothing in secret. If you're asking me about them, ask them. And then you just see someone standing there just open-handedly slap Christ. You have that attitude against the high priest? And notice Jesus' reply. The meekness of Jesus himself says, Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why smitest thou me? A very meek and humble way to say, why am I here? What are you accusing me of? Why are you hitting me? For answering the question. When someone made an attack directly against Christ like this right here, Christ did not get riled up. He did not use his power and authority over the situation. But look at the contrast when they attacked the temple of God, when they attacked God himself for the teachings. It was a little bit different. He understood the time and the place for which power and authority. By having this meekness, by being able to discern when to stand up, when to sit down, when to be assertive, when to be passive, when to use our power that we have. If we are meek, we shall inherit the earth. Something I saw as I look through the Psalms and look through some of the contrast there is that we have so many that don't understand what the earth is even for. We don't know why we're even here. What is our purpose on earth? What is the purpose for these material things? What's the purpose of even owning or physically having this book or having any of the luxuries of life, having some clothing to wear? What's the purpose? What is it that we should have? When we stop and think about it, we can look at the Egyptian bondage when they're let out. The generation that was faithful and looked to God had meekness, were allowed to enter the promised land. If we look at it, that was not the adults that walked out of Egypt. Because of their disbelief, because of their arrogance, they were not meek in heart, and they were not allowed into the promised land. Only 2 over the age of 20 were allowed in because of their faith, because of their meekness towards God. So those that were able to come up under the admonition of the Lord, under the idea of not being inside of Egypt and being able to look to God, were allowed in. It's not the earthly possessions that are the inheritance, and it will not be the driving goal of a meek person. My goal on earth, if I am to be a meek person, is not to accumulate as much as I can possibly get. It is not to take and have the most toys or the best toys. There's nothing that says I can't have things. But what is my focus? The meek will appreciate the things on earth more than those who are trying to possess and rush after for the earthly gain. The meek person knows that they have to be humble of heart, that they have to be focused towards Christ. I almost look at these Beatitudes as building blocks, because before any of these others have to happen, we have to look back to the first one. Blessed are the poor in spirit. If we think too highly of ourselves, will we be meek? will we allow ourselves to mourn at the appropriate times? We have to build and look and work ourselves towards this. And we would know that our focus is not of this earth. Now, we need things here to be able to survive, to be able to have a living, to work, so that we may eat, so that we may provide for others, but yet, can we do so in a meek manner? Peter reminds us to watch for the day of the Lord when we shall inherit the spiritual new heaven and new earth. Those that are meek will be able to inherit this. As Christ has said, as David illustrated back in Psalms, as Peter reiterates up here in 2 Peter, what are we looking for? The meek person will be looking ahead for an eternity. The earthly person is looking ahead at their next gain. Which one do we look for? People cannot fully appreciate the Word of God unless they are meek. Otherwise, they may argue, question, be stubborn, or angry against it. We have examples of this throughout the New Testament. As Christ taught and as the apostles taught, how many rejected the Word because of their lifestyle? Their lifestyle, not the sacrifice and life of Christ or the will of God. How many in the Old Testament can we go back to and look at that? They were too self-centered and not humble-natured. But those who are meek, when we read the Bible, reason it out, will accept what it has to say. When a command is present, it will be followed from the heart. We'll follow it no matter what it says. If it says, believe on me, we'll believe on him. If he says all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, then we will understand that and have sorrow in our heart. We will mourn for our bad decisions. When it says repent and be baptized for the remission of sins, we will do so. When it says live faithfully, live for Christ, live for God, put him above self, as a meek, charactered individual, we will do so. The question then becomes, when we look at the mirror, when each one of us looks in the mirror, what do we see? And I'm not thinking just the physical characteristics, I'm thinking, what do we see inside? What character do we portray? Do we have the meekness that Christ describes that will allow us to inherit the earth? He's talking about, blessed are they that will inherit the kingdom. Will we inherit the earth? Will we inherit what we have currently? Do we appreciate the things that are present in our lives? If we don't appreciate them, Christ gives us that opportunity to become appreciative of all things. Learn of him, accept him, and live for him. If we have done so, then we can take and continue to live for him faithfully each and every day. If we stumble, he is there to help us back along the path. If there's anyone that has need of the invitation, allow yourself to be meek. Allow ourselves to open up and live for Christ. And refocus ourselves if that is the need. The invitation is given. Any are welcome to come if you have the need. Well, together we stand and sing.